Welcome back to The Thoughtful Therapist. I'm Jimmy Slaughter. This is a quiet place for thought and reflection. No therapy, no coaching, just shared thinking. Today's episode 5, is The Wager We're Already Making. Let's take this one thought at a time. So before we start this episode, I want to say that it starts off being a little bit, I'll say, faith heavy, but it's just in the explanation. So stick with me throughout, and it's just the idea really that I'm looking to share, because I find this absolutely fascinating in way more ways than just faith. So let's go. I want to talk about a guy who wasn't really trying to prove anything. He wasn't trying to prove the existence of his faith or anything like that. He was just trying to solve a problem. And his name was Blaise Pascal. Now, Blaise Pascal was we'll say he was kind of a problem. Not in the sense that he caused a lot of problems, but that he saw them everywhere. He was a child prodigy, and as a teenager, he was already writing really serious mathematics. He made huge contributions to physics, geometry, fluid mechanics, and actually helped lay the foundation for probability theory. He wasn't just smart. He was the kind of mind that didn't just solve problems. He invented new ways of seeing them. Restless, brilliant, deeply sensitive to the limits of human understanding. Now, as a young man, he kind of was a pretty intense kid. He was always probing, questioning, never really satisfied by answers. And then he kind of got interested in gambling, not for like a casual reason because he thought it was fun, but as like an intellectual project. And he noticed that when he was gambling with a group of friends and it would end early, he and his friends started to ask, like, if the game was interrupted like this or we have to leave, how would we fairly divide the winnings? And that question became something much, much bigger. And it's actually the beginning of probability. Because of that issue, he developed the beginning stage of probability theory. Because he found out that uncertainty could actually be measured. And this is where it gets really interesting, because Pascal wasn't trying to understand faith or anything like that. He was just trying to understand risk at first. And at some point, something changed for him, not intellectually, but personally. He had what people describe as kind of a religious awakening, I guess, something he writes about later that he simply describes as fire. So on the night of November 23rd, 1654, he experienced something profound. He describes it in fragments that he carries around with him for the rest of his life, with words like certainty, joy, peace, fire. It wasn't really like a philosophical conclusion, but it was like an encounter that he had. It was a moment where the infinite seemed to touch the finite, and everything kind of shifted from there. He actually ended up sewing the record of that night into the lining of his coat so he could carry it with him always. Now, this is a little tricky, right? Because when we talk about religious awakening, it sounds pretty vague. But for Pascal, it wasn't just a shift in thinking, it was an event. He experienced something. Much like Augustine, who sat in a garden and he was conflicted and he heard a voice saying, take and read. And he opened a text and something in him he responded as just kind of settled. It just made sense. Isaac Newton's journey was a little bit slower. It was a long and obsessive search, not just for how the world works, but why it exists at all. Kierkegaard himself wrestled with anxiety and the limits of reason. He spoke of a leap of faith, not because faith is irrational, but because reason alone can't carry you across the gap between knowing and living. It's a leap you take when you realize some truths can only be lived and never proven. Some are moments, some are processes for all of these big thinkers, but they share something. They aren't purely logical. They're not conclusions you arrive at with enough data. There's no research. They're just experiences that seem real, and they seem to change how someone sees everything afterwards. If I'm being honest, I think that's kind of like the thing that's missing for me with faith. It's not an argument that I'm looking for. It's not a better explanation. I think that there's plenty of those. But something more like what Pascal experienced, a moment, a shift. Something that makes it feel less like a decision and more like something I see or experienced. Something that would, move me from wondering into believing. Now, here's the crux of the episode. Pascal ends up developing something called the wager. Now, while Pascal had lots of writings, right, he wrote about all sorts of stuff. He's an absolute genius. This idea of the wager was never something that he actually finalized. It was written in bits and pieces in journals. It was kind of an idea that he was always working on that he never totally concluded. So let's talk about the wager. Pascal's wager argues that it's rational to believe because the reward of being right is infinite, while the cost of believing and being wrong is finite, whereas the cost of disbelief is infinitely bad. We're going to live one way or another, as if there's something more or as if there isn't. But his general idea was that we don't get to sit this out. And if that's true, our life becomes something of a wager. Now, Pascal saw this with some level of unusual clarity. He didn't frame it as a belief in God or go to hell or anything like that. He framed it as a decision under uncertainty. Imagine if you had two columns, right? This is the best way I can come up with to describe this. On one side, you live as if your belief is correct. You orient your life towards something greater than yourself. You accept limits of what you can and cannot control. You even practice restraint, gratitude, love, meaning making. And if you're right, the potential gain is infinite. If you're wrong, you've lost very little. Maybe some pleasures in life, some certainty, maybe even a little bit of autonomy, but very little relative. And on the other side, you live as if it's not true. You treat life as that's all there is, and we simply maximize pleasure, minimize pain, create our own meaning. And if we're right, we've lived freely, but if we're wrong, the loss is infinite. Now, the logic here is actually simple. It's kind of ruthless, really. But when the potential downside is infinite and the cost of being wrong is infinite, the rational move is to bet on the side with the infinite upside. That was his whole idea. Even if you can't prove it. But there's kind of a human element here. He wasn't just making cold calculations. He was trying to solve the problem of how to live when certainty is impossible. Now, Pascal knew that most people didn't come to believe through logic, right? So he asked, what if you began living as if it were true? Act as if there is meaning. Act as if you are accountable. Act as if love and sacrifice matter. And see what happens to your heart over time. Now, this wager was not about winning an argument, although it has become quite the argument. It's about how you choose to spend the one life that you have. Now that I've laid out the wager, we're going to go in a little bit of a different direction here because there's a bunch of critiques about this, right? This has been, we'll call it a bugbear, right, for philosophy for quite some time. So there's lots of critiques, and we're going to get into those as well right now. But before going further, I just want to tell you, like, this wager makes sense in some logical form, but it feels kind of off. It feels too simple, which is probably my biggest critique of it. But there's just something uncomfortable about reducing faith to a wager, right? Like it feels like you've, I don't know, taken something that almost looks like trust or surrender and try to turn it into math or a calculation. And that's probably the first problem, right? But the second problem, what if you choose the wrong thing? If this is a bet, what exactly are you betting on? Because it's not just like God or no God. There are lots of different ideas of God. I think there's like 3,000 different faiths right now in the world. Different traditions, different ways of living. Philosophers sometimes call this the many gods problem to this. And honestly, it makes the wager feel almost impossible to apply cleanly. And it's not just theoretical. This is where real tension shows up between people. Because if you truly believe that your tradition is right, then almost by definition, the others are wrong. And sometimes not just wrong, but like dangerously wrong. And that's where this idea of belief stops living in the abstract, right? It starts shaping how we see each other as friend or foe, as good or bad, good or evil, I suppose would be the other way. There's this really funny joke that I love in The Good Place that kind of explains this critique really well. I don't know if you've ever seen the show The Good Place. It's great. But the main character is sitting in a room with this architect of the afterlife. And she is asking questions and they end up talking something about this, right? Like what ended up being true, right? Like who's the real person to believe in or the thing to believe in? And the architect of the afterlife says, there was this guy, I can't remember what his name was, but he goes on this mushroom trip and comes out and just goes on this epic rant and gets like 85% of the afterlife right, but he's still wrong. And it's really funny to think about like that, because it points at something pretty real. Like, what if you're just close, but not close enough? And the real answer is something completely unexpected. I don't know, like Hypnotoad in Futurama. But not because that's likely, but because once you open the door to this, then you kind of have to pick the right belief for this wager to, I don't know, have made sense. And it makes the whole thing seem way less simple. The next big critique. Can you even choose belief? That part never quite sat right with me either. There's actually a name for this objection. The idea that belief isn't something that you can just decide to have. You can choose how to act. You can live as if something is true, but belief itself, it's way harder. This is one of the questions that Jordan Peterson always gets really caught up on, right? Like, do you believe? And he's like, I don't know what you mean by believe, I think. Because it's a hard question. You don't just flip a switch and like become convinced. So does this turn faith, this whole thing, this wager, does it turn faith into a strategy? And maybe this is the part for me that feels most uncomfortable. Because if I believed it's the safest bet, is that really belief or is that just a strategy? It starts to feel like I'm not trusting something, but I'm like hedging a bet. And if there is something like God, would that kind of belief even really count? Or would it feel, I don't know, cynical? And what about the cost? Now, Pascal suggested that the cost of belief was quite small, but that depends on how you see it. For some people, belief comes with real trade-offs: time, energy, freedom, ways of thinking, ways of living your life. And even if those become meaningful later, they don't always feel small at the beginning, right? Like, I know lots of people of faith who have made really big sacrifices to these things: time, energy, freedom, ways of thinking, ways of living, choices that we make, the way that we're seeing the world. And at first, it's really difficult. It does get easier, it seems like. So, like I said, it doesn't always feel small in the beginning, but there's even a deeper twist. Because some people have pointed out even a more uncomfortable truth, which is, if God is good, truly good, maybe honest doubt is better than forced belief, right? Maybe someone who wrestles honestly and can't quite believe is closer to truth than someone who believes just to be safe. But what's really interesting is even with all of that, the situation doesn't just go away. You can't just like reject this wager completely, because you're still left with the problem. You still have to live. And we still have to make choices. What matters, what doesn't, what you're willing to give yourself to, sacrifice, love, our behaviors. And that part doesn't wait for certainty. It doesn't wait for clarity. So maybe the wager isn't trying to answer everything. Maybe it's more just pointing out something we'd rather avoid, that we're kind of already doing this. Whether we call it belief or not, whether it's a lifestyle choice, whether it's Republican, Democrat, whether it's on some of the major issues that are plaguing us today, maybe we're already living as if we've placed our wager, which is so interesting to me. And that's the whole point of this episode. It's not even necessarily about faith. It's about everything else. So there's a lot of modern thinkers who have thought about this, right? And we'll call it the wager today. And maybe this isn't a philosophical idea from a few hundred years ago. Maybe it's still playing out and how people live. You'll hear someone like Jordan Peterson, I'll repeat, when he asked if he believes in God, he gets really caught up on, what do you mean believe? And for him, it seems to be less about an intellectual assent and more about how one orders their life, their patterns, sacrifices, and responsibilities that they choose to live by. Alex O'Connor is another great example. He's a fantastic thinker. I really like him a lot. But he started from a place of pretty strong atheism, right? He was part of the new atheist movement. And he was a really sharp critique of religion. And over time, he's moved towards more of an agnostic, open-minded area of belief. He still questions constantly, but he's less certain, and he's willing to sit down with these unknowns and actually engage in them. You have people like Sam Harris, who tried to build meaning and reality and all of that contemplative practice without any meaning behind it, right? He shows that research for a grounded life can even continue without the metaphysical framework of faith. You know, there's a lot of critiques in his work as well. He tends to be, we'll say, a little bit more aggressive towards faith. And then there are people who will just walk the faithful path, those who have made that leap and describe this kind of steadying presence, sense of being held by something larger than their own reason. Now, that doesn't mean that these people are better or worse. That's not my intention here. There's just lots of different ways of thinking this. So all these journeys look different on the surface, right? One person steps into faith and finds peace. Another steps away from it and finds clarity. And the third just remains in this tension, refusing to come up with a conclusion because of all of these ideas, right? Like, is it a leap of faith? Is there enough evidence? So are they different? Or are they all just different ways of responding to the same underlying system, right? This wager. How do we live when certainty isn't given? That was Pascal's whole point. And then there's Albert Camus, who looked at the same gap Pascal saw, our deep longing for meaning in a universe that feels indifferent. He called it the absurd. He didn't offer faith as a solution, nor did he suggest we pretend the absurdity isn't there. Instead, he invited this kind of, we'll call it a quiet revolt, to live passionately, to create meaning, to love fiercely, not because the universe grants us permission, but specifically because it doesn't. And existentialism, at least in its more gentle forms, we'll call it, carries a similar spirit, right? It acknowledges that nothing is handed to us with meaning in it. Yet the brilliance of life is what we decide what matters, which is actually kind of awesome. We get to choose what we pour ourselves into, even when we know it's temporary, even though the universe might not notice or it's indifferent. But some people find that idea kind of terrifying, while others find it freeing. So do these ideas nullify the wager? It seems to me that the idea kind of still stands. We've already made our wager based on our actions, whether we admit it or not, whether it feels right or wrong. Even the choice to create meaning in an absurd world is a kind of a bet, right? That dictates how we live and what we want out of this world. So here's this really interesting thought experiment. It's called eternal recurrence. And the idea is, what if you were to live this exact life with all of its joys and all of its pains, the ordinary days, the hard days, over and over and over again forever? Would you say yes? And this is a really interesting question. It's like holding up a mirror to the life that we're already choosing. It's gentle, and this can be pretty uncomfortable. Is the way that I'm living something that I could actually stand to repeat? For some people, this feels crushing. For others, it becomes like, kind of a compass, as like a new way of looking at things. Maybe a call to live more intentionally, we could call it. Maybe more presently, more courageously, right? Break. And then there's Nietzsche's idea of amor fati, love of fate. Not the passive acceptance of whatever happens, but an active, almost fierce embrace of one's entire life. The joy, the pains, the good, the bad, the ordinary days, the everything. To look at your life and say something like, I wouldn't have it any other way. Now, this is kind of a radical affirmation almost. And it's a wager not on a better world somewhere else, but on this one. On this one right here, right now. Even here in the midst of all this uncertainty, we're choosing how to relate to life, right? Because we've been given this life and it's up to us. The choice is ours, and we've already made this choice. We're already living intentionally in this specific way. Even if we're just sitting and pondering how we're living it or what to do next or whatever, we're already making choices. And if you really want to feel the depth of Pascal's thinking, you have to go to his pensies, right? The fragments he left behind. And in them, you'll find a man that's not triumphant about faith. He's not pushing people towards that in any direction. He actually describes deep uncomfortability with the infinite silence and all of the infinite spaces. He wrestled with doubt his entire life, even after his fire awakening. And Kierkegaard, in a whole different century, took a similar honesty and pushed it further. Where Pascal offered a wager based on probability and infinite stakes, Kierkegaard spoke of a leap of faith, not because the leap is irrational, but because reason alone can't carry you across this chasm. Both men refused to pretend that the gap wasn't there. Pascal invited us to bet on the side with the infinite upside, while Kierkegaard invited us to leap anyway regardless. They arrived at different answers, but they were both refusing to live as if nothing mattered. At the end of this, I really want to make sure that I haven't just provided a religious lecture, because that's really not my point. It's the idea here that I love. So, based on my own personal, we'll say, Christian upbringing, I'll bring it into the best explanation that I can. I was always told, and always, I'm not going to say lectured, but I was always explained that God was one simple thing, was love, right? And love is a perfectly normal foundational thing that we humans experience. And so what's the other thing that we take a leap of faith for? Love. Or it doesn't have to be about faith, but we take leaps of faith for love all the time. When you meet a new friend, romantic partners, when you adopt a puppy or a cat, we take these leaps not because we know what's going to happen, but because we know what could happen. So I'm not saying any of this is right or wrong, just that they're all responding to the same problem. So how do you live? How do you know for certain that that's the right way to live? Now, you can critique this wager. You can pick it apart, as I have been attempting to do for quite some time. But I'm not really sure that the underlying reality is something that we can outthink, because we still have to live one way or another. And whether you realize it or not, we've already placed our bet. And maybe that's the part that matters most. It's not arriving at the answer, but noticing that the life is already building while we're asking the questions. Thank you for thinking it through with me. The Thoughtful Therapist. So if you're enjoying these videos and enjoy thinking about thoughts like this, like I do, please like and subscribe and leave me comments. Let me know what you're thinking, how you're thinking about this. Maybe you'll teach me something, which would be awesome, because that's kind of the whole point. I'd like to give a big shout out to Synergy Health Group. They're doing amazing work in therapy across the state of Florida. They do telehealth, they do counseling, and they do ABA work as well. There's a really wonderful company. Look them up, check them out. And if you guys or someone you know needs someone to talk to, I urge you to give them a call. Thank you so much.